Hey, what's up you guys? Nick here. For those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Nick. I'm a professional photographer. I've been shooting professionally for about 2 years, but I've been shooting for about 15 or 16 years ever since high school. And for those of you who are returning, thank you guys so much for checking out another video. Now last week we discussed f-stop and the practical use of f-stop in your photography. This week I want to talk about shutter speed and the practical use of shutter speed in your photography. And I know shutter speed is used for exposure, and we'll kind of go over that in this video. Next week we're going to do an ISO video, and then we'll wrap up this whole thing with a shooting in manual mode where I'll bring out the light triangle and go over how shutter speed, ISO, and f-stop interact with your exposure. But today I want to talk about the practical use of shutter speed and how you can use it to tell your story. So I set up an exercise using food coloring and water and shooting at different shutter speeds as I dripped the water in order to show you the practicality of it. Then I'm going to show you some examples of some photos I've done in the past and how to tell your story or get those cool effects you see, whether it's online or in magazines, to add to your photography. Now before we really get into that, I do want to discuss the DSLR cameras. Now your DSLR camera has what's called a curtain shutter. So you have an opening like that and it moves to block your sensor, show your sensor, and to block your sensor again. Now because of that, when you're in a studio and you're using studio lights, you can really only max out your shutter speed at about 1/200th of a second or 1/250th of a second, because if you go any faster than that, you'll actually capture part of your curtain shutter in there and you'll end up with a black line or an unexposed area across your sensor. Other than that, there's not really a whole lot to discuss on that side. I just wanted you guys to know that with a curtain shutter, you are limited in your speed in a studio setting with studio lights. So let's go over these photos, you guys. We'll kind of discuss what's going on in them and how to use those effects to your advantage. All right, so right here, I'm showing an image shot at 1/4000th of a second. And as you can see, I've almost completely captured those droplets coming out. There's no blurring, they're pretty clear, they're in focus, and they're sharp. And that's at 1/4000th of a second. Now let's move to the far end of that spectrum. This is at 1/10th of a second. And as you can see, it's blurry. We didn't quite capture the same sharpness or the same almost seizing the moment kind of thing. Now this is important because let's say you're doing sports photography and you need to capture motion. Now, in order to capture motion in sports photography, you need to have a really fast shutter speed. And that's because the shutter moves very quickly across your sensor, capturing that one moment. Now, if your shutter speed is set too low, it blurs. And that's how you get blurred images when something is moving. I don't know if you've ever had your camera phone and you took a picture in lower light and it's auto-adjusted for the light and someone moved their hand and their hand is blurry, but the rest of them are in focus. That's because the shutter speed is too slow to compensate for the lighting. So let's go ahead and go through these photos real quick. So again, we're back at 1/4000th of a second. Now we're going to move to 1/1000th of a second, and still they're pretty clear, they're in focus, they're relatively sharp. Now when we move to 1/500th of a second, you start getting a little bit of blur in your photo. The movement of the drop is kind of blurred because you're not capturing that momentary second. Instead you're capturing, even though it seems so little, you're still capturing some of that movement. Let's move to 1/125th of a second, which is a pretty standard shutter speed in the studio. I use between 1/25th and 200 in the studio with the lighting, and that's because I can get a little bit of motion in the photo, but it doesn't blur. But if anything's moving too quickly, it does blur. And as you can see in here, we've got the one droplet where it's kind of clear, but it's kind of hanging there. It hasn't exactly dropped yet. And then you actually have a little bit of a blur. Now at 1/50th of a second, the effect is very blurry. It's not that it's out of focus and it's not that it's not sharp enough, it's the fact that there was motion and it gives you a motionary blur. And then again, 1/10th of a second, you have a lot more blur and it's almost like a streak. Now how does this help you in practical photography? So the first image I'm going to show is of water. And that's what a lot of people use long exposure for, is in water photography. Now if you look at this image and you ignore the trees and that stuff and you just look at the water, it almost has a silky feel. So when you see images of waterfalls and things like that where it's silky looking, it's because of a longer exposure time. Some people use zero density filters for that. Some people just crank their ISO real low and use a really small f-stop. That's how you get that silky look with that. Now we're gonna look at a street photo I took. Now this is a long exposure. This one was like a 5-second exposure at 100 ISO, and I think I was shooting probably at about f11. That way everything was in focus for the story I was trying to tell. But as you can see, you can't see the cars, but you can see their lights. And that's because the camera picks up the light because it's brighter, but not the car, and it creates that blur. So when you see cityscapes or night photography, like of this one of the mountain in Steamboat, and you can kind of see the cars over here moving because you can see the headlights and the taillights, but the mountain is clear and the street lights are in focus. That's how you get that effect, is with a longer shutter speed or a longer exposure. Now on the flip side of that, let's go back to our waterfalls and our moving water. In this one, I've captured the water. I've captured the movement of the water and I froze it in time using a really fast shutter speed. And I was able to capture all the water and kind of freeze it in place and get a really clear, cool image of that. Now in the middle of that is a midway shutter speed. You kind of get a little bit of blur, a little bit of movement, and a little bit of the silkiness in the water. And it's not quite as sharp as the last image, but it's also not as silky as the image I showed a few images ago. Now some things to remember with shutter speed is there are some rules of thumb. At slower shutter speeds, you can actually move your camera. Your hands are never completely still, and actually your camera can pick up that blur. Now, a general rule of thumb is to never shoot at a shutter speed less than your lens. So let's take my Yongnuo, for example. So this is a 50mm. Now, in a full sensor setup, I would never want to shoot freehand under 1/50th of a second. And if you're using a crop sensor camera, you got to multiply that by either 1.5 or 1.6, depending on whether you're using a Nikon or a Canon. So it'll be about 85mm. So 1/80th of a second is the bare minimum that I can shoot freehand using the Yongnuo lens. Whereas the Sigma I have on my camera right now is a 10mm, 10 to 28mm. I can shoot between 1/10 of a second or 1/28th of a second freehand comfortably before having to bring a tripod in. Now, if you want to do long exposure, like really long exposure, you know, those 5, 20, or even 30-second shots, you absolutely need a tripod for that. I recommend using the timer on your camera or a remote. And the reason for that is even pushing the button can cause a little bit of blur as the camera moves on the tripod. Wind can also affect that if your wind is blowing your tripod around. So I do recommend investing in a sturdy tripod. So yeah, you guys, that's my practical guide to shutter speed and using it in your photography to not only create the effects you want, but to get the images that you want. So if you're wanting to get that cool silky effect, or you want to play with the lighting or do night photography, you really want to stay on the lower end of that spectrum of shutter speed. And if you're wanting to capture sports, events, cars, or even, I've seen some really cool aviation photography, you got to stay at that higher end of your shutter speed. Because all shutter speed really is how long your shutter is open, exposing light onto your sensor or your film, depending on what method you are using. So thank you guys again so very much for joining me tonight. Please like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell notification. Check out my social medias down below. I have a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You guys know about the YouTube page, so hit them up, subscribe, follow. Thank you guys again so much. You guys have a wonderful night, and next week we're discussing ISO. Have a good night. Bye.